So probably, Harriet, would you
I will
like?
start.
Yes, I think so, right?
Yeah.
And we can be just tolerant for a few seconds more because people are entering now, and whatever you say, it's okay. Huh?
Yeah.
We want to benefit from every second, right?
Right. So I'm delighted to welcome you all to the second in a series of conversations.
Yeah, a few of them are getting rings, but not all of them yet.
Please keep your microphones closed.
We're going to ask that people who are in the audience and not on the not asking questions yet will mute themselves. This is the second in a series of conversations about contemporary Jewry issues. This one is about Jews in the Americas, as you all know, I assume, if you're here. I wanted to give a brief introduction to the people that contributed to that special issue and who are here and will participate in the beginning of the discussion. We're aiming to leave about half an hour at the end for audience participation. If you have questions along the way, you're welcome, or comments that you would like us to pay attention to, put them in the chat. And I will look at them as much as I can, and Ellie will help me with them. Ellie is facilitating this, our technological facilitator, and we really are very, really appreciate all that you've done. We're here with the president of ASSJ. We're co-sponsoring with Contemporary Jewry and ASSJ. Those of you who have not seen this special issue, it may be because you're not members of ASSJ and you don't get a Contemporary Jewry subscription automatically. And I'm just going to put in that little plug that it's worthwhile. And I think when you hear some of the research that went into this special issue, you will agree with me. So I'm going to go in order of what I see on the screen, which is not going to be what anybody else sees probably, but just bear with me. The first person that's in the top row with me is Bob Abzug, and his research, he contributed to the introduction, and was part of one of the guest editors of the issue. This is a project that is ongoing. This is, I think, the first print product from the project of Jews in the Americas. Morton Weinfeld is sitting next to Bob, and he wrote on Canadians, together with Harold Troper, who's not with us today, Jewish communal responses to conflicts with the Canadian state, which we'll hear more about that a little later. Then I have Judit Liwerant Bokser, who all of you, Bokser Liwerant, sorry, it's not written right on your name tag there, who is president of ASSJ, but she's here as one of the guest editors of the special issue, and who wrote a very comprehensive introduction to the whole transnational, global, diasporic orientation of the project and the Americas, and looking at the Americas together. Naomi Lindstrom is also one of the guest editors, and her contribution was about Ariel Dorfman as an example of a transnational Jewish intellectual. Pierre Anctil, sitting next to her, wrote on Yiddish writers in the Americas, again, looking at transnational influences. Bruce Phillips wrote on how transnational perspectives changed the way that he looked at American ethnoburbs. Dalia Wassner wrote on the transnational Mexican Renaissance. And again, connections between Mexico and America. Laura Limonic wrote about Argentinian Chabad Lubavitch movement and transnational influences on that. Daniel Fainstein wrote about Rabbi Marshall Meyer as a transnational expatriate and innovative religious entrepreneur. And that's another form. There's all sorts of transnational forms that we read about in this issue, and it's really fascinating. Where do we go? Did I miss somebody, or did I get everybody that's on the panel? I know that Sergio DellaPergola is going to be joining us. He provided a demographic overview of the Americas, was one of the very active guest editors. He's in another function. He'll join us in about half an hour. We don't have to worry about traffic congestion, but there's other kinds of congestion. So hopefully he'll be with us in about half an hour. Okay, so I know that you can all have access to the journal and read the abstracts and read the articles that interest you. And I decided that that's not what we need to spend our time on here. So there are 3 sets of questions. I'm going to be asking each set and allowing the panelists to discuss it for a while. Given how many panelists we have, everybody's getting about 5 minutes total. And it'll be up to your questions afterwards to hear more about anything that intrigued you and you didn't get to hear more about. So the first set of questions, and anybody who knows me knows that when I ask questions, I ask pretty complex questions. There's about 5 questions in each of these groups of questions. But the first question, I think, that really struck me as the editor of the journal and not in this project is why the Americas? Why would you want to look at North America and South America and Central America and put them all together? I grew up in North America. I never thought about what I had in common with the rest of the Americas. So why the Americas? And what do the Americas have in common compared to other regions of Jews? Why should we care about, this is very ethnocentric, other parts of the Americas that aren't in the United States, when the majority of diaspora Jews in the Americas are in North America and in the United States? The majority of surveys and qualitative research that's done is taking place in the United States outside of Israel. And the visibility of Jewish community planning is much greater in the United States than elsewhere in the Jewish world. So what do we gain by looking at the Americas as a unit and as an approach? And I'm going to ask Bob to start out with some remarks. I'll have Pierre follow him, and then we'll see where we go from there.
Okay. I've been interested in this problem for a long time, or this question, why the Americas? And in fact, to some degree, Naomi and I sort of pioneered this at the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies at University of Texas. I'm a historian, so I write books, not articles. And so I'm not quite prepared. I didn't contribute an essay, but here are some things I'm thinking about as I'm moving toward my research. First of all, in the background, why the Americas, aside from it being 42% of the Jews in the world or something like that, and I'm glad Sergio isn't here to correct me, but in any case, that alone has something to say. The other is that, well, if you sit in North America, if you sit in fact, the United States, and you look at, as Harriet said, the scholarly production, community life, all the rest, it's all quite visible, certainly if you're here, here in Texas or here in New York, that that's the big story. But I don't think so. And I think one of the big stories is the interaction of Canada and the United States. And it's where my research is moving. But also obviously Latin America, as we'll hear about, the creation of a new Jewish community in Argentina because of Marshall Meyer. But my special interest in the future are actually a couple of things related to Jews who aren't big machers in the community and aren't scholars. And it's basically, what is everyday life for Jews like, and how does it differ in small town America and later small town Canada? And one of the things I'm interested in is, one, the adaptation that Jews go through when they are 12 people in a town of 400 or 1,200 people in a town of 3,000 or whatever, or more, 30,000, let's say. How does that happen? What kind of community life do they have? And believe it or not, there are sources. One of the places I started was in the state of Montana, which has 1,200 Jews in a population of about 1.2 million people. Now, and by the way, has been this of interest to Laura perhaps, is that lately Chabad has made a big push in Montana to seek out all the crypto Jews and all the Jews who are below the level of community life and redo that. We don't know yet how successful they'll be. But for instance, Jews have been in the Montana territory since the 1870s, 1880s. 1,200 Jews approximately in territory days. So the Jewish population hasn't grown, and actually the Anglo population hasn't grown all that much. It's very much a state, by the way, of Native Americans. But what is interesting to me is that Jews had some influence, public influence. For instance, Jenny the Jew, who was the best madam in Butte, Montana in territorial days. This is of interest. But also Sol Starr, who, if some of you saw the series on HBO, Deadwood, you know that he becomes mayor of Deadwood. And he is a German Jew. He's from, well, some sources say he's from Vienna, others from Bavaria, but of course in those days, it was all mixed up. So that's just one part of the research. The other part is that I'm interested in, and this would go for all of the Americas, is how does one talk about the dominant communities in which Jews exist in various places in the Americas? How do they differ? Is it just one story all the time? Obviously, if one is in a Catholic versus a Protestant versus, who knows, a New Age community, these are different kinds of contexts. And one of the reasons why I'm interested in this, and then I'll end because I've probably already taken 7 minutes, is that a lot of my research as a scholar of US history has been in religious history. And when you write about religious history in America, pardon me, in the United States, you're talking about American Protestantism and maybe a little bit of American Catholicism. So I know those communities, and I've always wondered how Jews fit in, not in Austin, Texas, which I know well, or New York, or the Bay Area. These are the places I know well, but how about Bozeman, Montana? Anyhow, that's where I'm going.
Thank you. Pierre, do you want to follow up?
Yes, I'm an historian also, so I'll pick up on what Robert has said. I live in Montreal, and I've recently published a book entitled History of the Jews in Quebec, translated from the French. And my remarks will be very broad on the history of the Jews in the Americas. About 1900, there developed a situation which was unique in modern Jewish history, when the entire hemisphere received, in a matter of a few years, a massive Jewish immigration wave. Other parts of the world too, but it's a fact that we took some time to realize in Canada that what was coming in Canada was also coming in other places in the Americas. What's very interesting in this is it originated from the Russian Empire, this wave, and was suffused with the shtetl culture and the situation in the Pale of Settlement. So it's a fairly uniform contingent of immigrants, culturally and as well, suffering under the same oppressive political regime of the late Russian imperial age, who spread all at once in a matter of 10 to 15 years over 35 countries, 12 in South America, 23 in North America, of course, some of them in North America and the Caribbean, very small. We're speaking of 1 million, basically, roughly, Russian Jews, which was made, this event was made possible by a revolution in maritime transportation and railroad transportation. It was the largest migration movement in Jewish history up to that point. It spread very quickly in several very different places, simultaneously. Different regimes politically, as Robert has expressed, different religions, many different languages, English, Spanish, Portuguese, and even French in parts of Canada, many Native American languages as well. It was confronted with a very broad, very different fragmented reality once it reached America. And of course, many of the immigrants did not know this, nor did they know where they were going exactly. And also very vastly different economic environments, sometimes urban, or as Bob has expressed, sometimes quite rural. The critical element here is in almost every place, except the US and central coastal US, the East European Jewish element did constitute the first instance of Jewish community formation where they reached the place they reached. In Canada, at least 95% of the Jewish community is at that time of East European Jewish origins. If we look at data from 1931, Yiddish is the mother tongue of 99% of Canadian Jews. This gives you a very good portrait of what's going on. In other words, there had been almost no significant Jewish presence in almost all these countries, the hemisphere, before the Great Migration of 1904, 1914, except in the US, which forms an exception in this respect because the layering of various immigration is much deeper, including German Jewish. Yiddish, I argue, became the language and cultural vehicle of this entire movement. And diaspora nationalism, as personified by Chaim Żytlowski, for instance, developed in all these countries: Yiddish schools, Yiddish newspapers, Yiddish cultural institutions. Yiddish became the major conduit of communication between Jews living in these different parts, not able to necessarily meet easily because of the vastness of the continent, at least until World War II and perhaps until the 60s. In my article, I explain the career of Jacob Isaac Segal, who came from the Ukraine in 1910. By the end of World War II, he was known all over the continent. He had reviews in Argentina, reviews in New York, and we haven't looked at other places seriously. I also examined the careers of Milachavich and other Yiddish survivors of the Shoah. Milachavich lived in Mexico, in the US, and finally ended up in Montreal in 1941. He published books of poetry and essays all along the way as he moved from south to north. This is quite an interesting feature of Jews crossing political boundaries and vast areas and national languages without blinking an eye. New York, Montreal, Buenos Aires being major centers from our point of reference, of course. Even after the Shoah and the destruction of East European Jewish culture, I will conclude, it's a unique occasion for historians to examine what became divergent in these circumstances and what remained consistent about this Jewish establishment development over long periods and vastly different countries, all from a common historical starting point. We have to share data by national origins, Canada, US, Argentina, Brazil, and so on, about Jews. We haven't done this very much, both historically and more recently, contemporarily. We have to compare the demographic growth and institutional development in various countries, the process of adaptation, integration, assimilation, the shaping of Jewish identity. What is common, what diverges. We have to examine the Yiddish press and the literary production across countries in several languages, some Jewish, some not Jewish, and study seriously the legacy left by this period in contemporary Jewish populations and communities across the Americas, which was not done seriously up to now. And there's much to be learned from this process. Thank you very much, Harriet.
Thank you. Now we'll go to Mort, another Canadian, and then Laura, and then we'll see where we go.
Thank you, Harriet. I'm a Canadian, but like Pierre, also a Quebecer. Just wanted to put that down. English-speaking Quebecer, but anyhow. Before I make my remarks, just 5 minutes or so, I want to pay tribute to Chaim Avni. Many of you know that name, former professor at the Hebrew University, and pioneer in this field of Latin American Jewish studies. To be specific, in 1970, I was a graduate student at the Hebrew University, and I took a course from Chaim Avni on Latin American Jewry, of which I knew nothing at the time. Frankly, I don't know if I've increased that knowledge a great deal. That's my problem. But I just wanted, and Chaim Avni, by the way, was very interested in comparing Argentinian Jewry and Canadian Jewry. He actually wrote articles on that topic. I also want to briefly mention a shout out to Adina, who is with us. Adina Bankir Karp. I was and we were together a few days ago in a panel in the Canadian Jewish sociology meetings on comparing Canadian Jewry and Australian Jewry. So in a sense, I feel I'm being torn apart, maybe like that baby in the Solomons. You know, on the one hand, Canada is part of the Americas, but maybe Canada should also be studied in the Anglosphere context with Australia and other countries. Now, I think that's something we may come back to. And lastly, Barry Chiswick, who is with us, has published written about Canadian and American comparisons in terms of economic achievement and what have you. So Harold Troper and I wrote a paper which we called Between Stadlanut and Never Again. And then we looked at various case studies of how Jews in Canada responded or acted to a variety of public policy sorts of issues or political issues, starting with World War II and going to the present. So first of all, the title was deliberately provocative. I don't know if it'll be provocative here. The idea Between Stadlanut and Never Again. Why do I say provocative? Because I think one of the legacies of the Shoah, unless I'm misinformed, is the idea that we Jews must always be very assertive, very strong, very aggressive, and fight in a militant way, in an aggressive way, to defend our rights when they're under threat. And I think the idea of Stadlanut or Shashtil or whatever term you want to use for sort of establishment practices is in disrepute. When we took a look at the whole sweep of these efforts, I think we found that there was actually a time and a place for both. For the traditional quiet diplomacy in Jewish life, and then the more aggressive, more militant forms. I will have to leave it there. You can look at case studies about this, like the Soviet Jewry movement or what have you. But the interesting question, of course, is this a unique finding to Canadian policy? Or did other Jewish communities also find themselves caught between the more traditional and the more aggressive forms of advocacy for Jewish causes? Many years ago, Harold Troper and I published a book called Old Wounds: Jews, Ukrainians, and the Hunt for Nazi War Criminals in Canada. And it was about the decision about 30 or 35 years ago of the Canadian government to look for Nazi war criminals that had snuck into the country. Most of those, by the way, were of Ukrainian origin. Think of John Demjanjuk, if you want an American parallel. And when Harold and I look back now at this exercise, we realize this was a kind of an uber transnational operation, because the issue of Nazi war criminals and perhaps Ukrainian war criminals was related to the issue of Ukraine in World War II and the Soviet Union in World War II and the Soviet Union after World War II in terms of its justice system. It goes on and on. And by the way, I think a lot of the issues that we talked about in this book, which was published a long time ago, suddenly in the past few months have become relevant again. But that's another issue. The last thing I want to make, again, maybe this will be provocative, is I love the way Harriet framed this. You know, what do the Americas have in common? Why should we care about those parts of the Americas that are not the United States? Right? And we go on Latin. Okay. So it's an intriguing question. And I'm just wondering, in moving forward, whether we ought to really try to excommunicate the United States from our framework, because we want to maintain the importance and the visibility of these non-American units. Another way to proceed might be, and I'll just put it out there, to recognize that the United States is the elephant in the room. It's the elephant in every room. And therefore, one interesting and legitimate thing to study is the way in which the American Jewish influence does impact, in many ways, in the Americas, the evolution of Canadian and I think Latin American Jewry, and not necessarily to see this in a pejorative fashion. So I hope some Americans won't mind me making this comment. Some of the Canadians might accept it, or Latinists accept this, but I'm just interested in how, as we move forward, our posture vis-a-vis the United States can evolve. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Laura?
Great. Well, I'm following two Canadians. So my focus is really on Latin America. And I thought about your question, Harriet, and so I'm just pulling up some notes. And I wanted to think, again, I am not a historian, I'm a sociologist, but I do think a historical perspective is particularly important in this case, particularly when we look at the case of Latin America and Canada, obviously, and really getting at this idea of, you know, a comparative perspective and what does this offer us? And in many ways, the migration streams, and I think Bob said this, were very similar at the time. There were some sort of cutoffs due to different policies, particularly here in the United States. And I'm thinking of 1924 as a sort of a big number that pushed a lot of people to Latin America. But the push reasons or the push factors that led people to leave and the demographics were very similar. So you have this sort of similar migration going to different regions. And they developed communities, they developed ethno-religious identities that in many ways are similar, but are also different. So that allows us to really understand, is it the place or is it the people? In many ways, Jews across the Americas really experience upward mobility. In Latin America, it might have taken a little bit longer, but they all, and I'm thinking of all, not only the stories, right? Because we can think about the literature of American Jews and the literature of Latin American Jews that so vividly describes settling into the region, but really also the historical documents. It shows us a little bit about how they settled, where they lived, the kinds of associations, the mutual aid associations that they formed, the kinds of occupations that they were employed in, or on, there were many of them were really peddlers, small-time merchants, and this is across the region. So we see a great deal of upward mobility, which really begs the question: well, is it the time, right? Is it the time that they settled, and we're beginning to see a kind of development of the region? So how does that, or is it the Jews in particular? So I think that's one very interesting thing to think about. I think the other thing to think that I think is very interesting is in many ways how Latin American Jewish communities stayed to some extent much more tight-knit than they did in the United States. So what does that mean when we can think about the levels of religiosity and what they mean in the United States, how people integrate, right? How immigrants have integrated along religious lines in the United States compared to Latin America, and how ethnicity is really means different things in different contexts. So what that means for Jewish people also, which I think also it becomes a very interesting sort of comparative perspective that I think the Latin American case is and I cannot speak about the Canadian case, in any meaningful way. So I will concentrate on Latin America. So that's sort of like the first larger issue that I think is important. The second one that I think is important is also thinking about when we think about, as Harriet said, well, why do we care about anything but American Jews? Well, who are American Jews? American Jews are really at this point, the grandchildren, for the most part, of Jewish immigrants, right? And they're the ones that these Jewish immigrants had defined what it means to be an American Jew. But today we're having large streams of contemporary Jewish migrants, and they're redefining what it means to be an American Jew, particularly in areas where we see large numbers of immigrants. And I'm thinking particularly of Miami, and how the Miami Jewish community, which has the largest number of Latin American Jewish immigrants, how the Jewish institutions in many ways have been transformed because of the large influx of Latin American Jews. And then the third, I guess, theme that I think is important is the idea of religiosity. And religiosity as a transnational religiosity. And in this particular case, my focus is Chabad. And Chabad is in many ways where the focus or the locus of Chabad is. I live in Crown Heights. I'm a few blocks from 770, which is the sort of, the headquarters of it's the mothership. Yet it has become a transnational religion, in many ways different than the ethno-Jewish religion and identity that existed beforehand. So I think there's much more to explore about Chabad, but I think what becomes very interesting is how it's taking place in Latin America, how in many ways Latin American transmigrants are really a locus around which this religious movement is built, right? It's while the Chabad is centralized, in many ways it's a decentralized religious movement, and how the constant back and forth, particularly among Latin American Jews to the United States, back to Latin America, back to the United States, really influences the transnationalism of Chabad, and I would even say the expansion of Chabad. And I will stop it.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll go to Sergio and then to Judit. And I'll just say that Sergio, everybody has been warned about 5 minutes at the most or something like that. And we welcomed you before you came, so.
Thank you. Thank you, Harriet. Hi, all. Well, of course, of all the panelists, editors, writers, I am the least American. I think I'm the only one who wasn't born on the American continent, but I made a calculation. I spent something like 4 years of my life in the United States and a month is here and there in Latin America and Canada. So I know to find my way in the continent. I think I want to say just a few words precisely on this, on looking at things from the outside. Again, I'm not a total outsider, but I acknowledge that it's quite different to look at the world not being part of the daily experience, not only academic, but simply life and Jewish life in particular. And I think that a blend of different people, locals in different ways, and someone from the outside is a good thing for academic project like this that wanted to raise awareness about the extension of the Jewish world. And of course, one of the big questions we wanted to check was the commonalities and the differences between the different parts. Now, it's true that the same reasoning can apply to also to other continents in the world. There is no reason not also to incorporate Europe or Asia and Africa and Australia, but it was particularly important and fascinating to see first the Americas. I am among those who are a bit, if I might say, critical of the use of the word America as a synonym for the United States. I think it is not just, and so it's nice to try to apply the Americas or America in the appropriate sense. And so, in fact, at the center of the perspective of this volume that has appeared in Contemporary Jewry, and thanks to Harriet for leading the journal, and a warm hello to all of the co-editors. At the center was nevertheless the question whether there are commonalities and differences. And I think, at least in my own specific area of interest, which is perhaps the most macro of all, the answer is yes and no. That is, we can find certain fundamental processes where the continuity between all of the components of the puzzle is what is more evident. For example, the dependency of Jews, no matter where, on the level of socioeconomic development or human development, if you wish. And therefore, the fact that to some extent, the size of populations, the density of Jewish populations out of the total, and also the flux of international migration, to some extent it is predictable, and also internally within the major countries. So that in the end there has been a fantastic process of adaptation over the several generations that has brought to a lot of coherence, which crosses definitely the national boundaries. So this is one example. On the other hand, on other accounts, and one example is, to me, a very prominent example is the structure and concept of Jewish education across the Americas. And then on another account, which is also important, and that's the structure of the system of Jewish identification. On these accounts, I think we find, whether we like it or not, that the United States of America is a different case. The other countries, no matter whether north or south of the United States, tend to be more similar among themselves. And America is different. There is definitely a different configuration in Jewish education, at least looked at not in great detail, but typologically. And then the big and intriguing question that now is the thing that is most of all attracting some of my fantasy and time, and I wonder whether there is an answer to that. is that when you apply certain methodologies and techniques to the study of Jewish identity, you find that there is a lot of coherence. Jewish identity, of course, as we all know, is a cluster of different options, and the options are known. And once you plot those options on a page of white paper, you find that the mental map of the options is very similar all across the world. There is a circular mode of display, which I simply will translate into the word specialists and specializations. There are those who are specialists on ritual, and those who are specialists on history, and those who are specialists in volunteerism. And then there is a particular spot which is the center. The question is there something which can coordinate the different specializations of Jews in terms of their own preferences for this or that type of Jewish identity? And the fact is that all over the Americas, with one exception, the answer is yes. And the answer gives that there is a certain sense of Jewish peoplehood that maybe is not very highly defined, but is in fact representing the kind of mediator between the more secular and the more religious, and the more Jewish-centered and the more universal-centered options of Jewish identity. And so Jewish peoplehood appears nearly everywhere. In Canada, it appears in the Latin American countries. By the way, it also appears in Australia, and it appears in Western Europe. But there is one country, a little small exception to the rule, and that's the United States of America. In that particular case, I couldn't find what is the element that connects the differences within the community. This is a big question mark at the center of the identificational map. Jewish peoplehood is important, but it takes one part of the attention. Israel, by the way, in spite of discourse about being close or being distant, is a very important component in the Jewish identity of US Jews. But none of this is central. What is the central spot in that perception is still a mystery to me. That is, I have my hypothesis, but I will keep it for me, maybe for the second paper. And so with this, I hope that others may volunteer their idea. To conclude, I just say that just by looking at the faces of so many friends and colleagues on the screen right now, I see that there is a huge potentiality for a second volume and maybe a third volume. In a project like this, we could not include everyone, and we miss some of them. There are visible spots missing in the ground that we could cover. And so I think this calls absolutely for continuing this form of collaboration, keeping in mind again that it's not just a position of one piece next to the other, but it is the dynamic interaction between the pieces that is what interests us. And so I think it augurs well for the continuation of this study of Jews in the Americas.
Thank you. Judit, before you get to talk, I'm going to just read what the second group of questions is, because I know Sergio already started to move into them, and I know that you also, some of what you have to say is going to move into them. So I want people to hear them. And it's more of a methodological point of view, I think. But it's, what does this transnational perspective, what's the advantage of it? When looking at the Americas and looking at, in general, at Jews, I would say. What has the research in this issue of contemporary Jewry taught us about fashioning transnational research of good quality? And how do the various disciplinary approaches, I mean, you started out and said, I'm not a social sociologist, I'm not a social scientist, I'm a historian, but we know that historians are also social historians. And we already have a comment about, you're going to hear later about economics getting in there. What does this transdisciplinary perspective add to us? What's the difference between juxtaposition that Sergio referred to, or side-by-side comparisons and intersectional perspectives, including transnationalism. And what are the trade-offs of studying a situation or a society or societies as insiders or outsiders, which Sergio also referred to. And I'm just going to make one comment. Morton mentioned that the United States is the elephant in every room. Elephants are different from everybody else. You can't ignore it. And so it's not surprising that the United States comes out kind of different, but we'll hear more about that. I didn't want, Judit, go ahead. You can bridge between the first and the second question.
Okay, we'll try. So thank you. Hello to everyone. Just before sharing with you my remarks, it's interesting because looking at this idea of the insider and outsider, and as Harriet well knows, I defined myself as the perfect outsider, not only in North America, but also in Israel. And regretfully, I belong to both. So, well, I say regretfully, not because I belong, because I still are seen as an outsider. And I want to tell you that when you invited me to be a discussant of your wonderful award presentation, the Marshall Sklar Award, I started with that reflection. I went to Marshall Sklar and to many other sociologists trying to see how we benefit from being inside and outside. And I would say that ultimately social sciences and the humanities, I mean, scientific knowledge in general, and I have a wide perspective of what I include in scientific knowledge, not only hard sciences, but humanities and social sciences that deal with hard problems. I would say that our conceptual and methodological resources are the ones that let us really overcome the limitation of being inside or outside exclusively and try to move and oscillate between them. Let me refer to what we aim, what was the goal of this project as it started, because the participation of the authors are already reflecting what we aim. I think that first was, and now I'll see, outside and inside challenges. I consider that we wanted to address a serious dilemma that synthetically I would define like this. In diaspora studies, and I bring inside the concept of diaspora, the Jewish case has been diminished and it's no longer a central question. It's not part of the archetypical diasporas that were analyzed and studied. Diaspora studies, in addition to migratory and ethnic approaches, focus on diaspora practices, praxis, and projects of new diasporas, mainly Asians, Chinese, Hindi, Pakistani, Middle Eastern, Lebanese, Palestinian, Eastern Europeans, Baltic, German, Hungarians, Romanians, Russians, Belarusians, etc., and other ethno-national communities. Simultaneously to this displacement of the focus of the Jewish case in transnational studies, it has been minimized the issue of inner cohesion, border maintenance of a group, and the diasporic associational and institutional density of our, I would say, object now or case at hand, that's the Jewish case. Therefore, the Jewish case has been at the best subsumed under the critique of the ethnic lens. I do think that today, contemporary Jewry needs to locate itself inside this wide discussion. And there are many, many dimensions that this concrete issue, that is the first, I would say, published material of this project, bring to the attention of the reader. We need to first overcome the situation of the Jewish case as an exceptional case, or overcome the methodological nationalism that means that social processes and social life develops only inside the national and state borders. The weight of diasporic life and its organizational system, its cultural production, its transmigration, its waves that are historically displaying, all these allows us for approaching an expanding conceptual field in transnational studies. And this is what we need to take into account, how we can contribute to contemporary Jewry, expanding, as my previous colleagues mentioned, the national borders, recovering this idea of a culture of circulation that diasporas have, see how the interaction goes. And to be brief, I will address with certain, I wouldn't say surprise, my article as Harriet defined is the first article that brings the author into this triad of diaspora, globalization, and transnationalism. But what I ask is precisely an openness to an aggiornamento, if we may say so, that brings contemporary Jewish studies to working on what we have been now pointing out, the mediation, the in-depth complementary relation between disciplines that pertain to social sciences and humanities, plus the interaction between disciplines inside humanities and the social sciences. And this, to end, begs the question of which is the space where these mediations and articulations are to be formulated, in order to evoke the transition and interactions that favor encounters between us, between our research, between disciplinary logics we are in, and the specialized languages, various methodological resources, and cognitive identities. I then pose these questions. How do we transition from the individual to community, from community to society, from homeland to diaspora, from community to nation and state, from country to region, and from there to new centers of existence, the national, the local, the regional, the global, the transnational, are different levels, and one should not be subsumed in the other. And also, I would say, how we transit from everyday language to official discourse that are part of some of our analyses, from literary creation to testimony, where brings cultural studies and historians, from social territory to the deterritorialization of culture, from the everyday existent inside and outside institutions, and from the deep, you were referring to that, Laura, the deep privatization of religion to a more public presence. I think that here we have a wonderful sphere of development that I don't think we disregarded since our first meetings, seminars, conferences, and discussions. So now we should continue exploring, precisely looking at this point, right? Inside and outside institution, present and past, I think that Jews have a past history of dispersion that can be erased. The past and the present are part, constitutive part of the transnational perspective. How do, to finish, transit from a concrete particularity to a concrete universality? So here we have really serious challenges, and listening to you, to my previous colleagues, and I'm sure the one that continues after this intervention, I think we are into a very, I would say, fruitful field of encounters. Thank you. Thank you, Harriet, again for this great effort. Thank you, Adina, for joining Contemporary Jewry. And thank you to my colleagues, the co-editors, the authors.
Thank you. Okay, then we'll go to Bruce and then Dalia, and then we'll see. I know we want to get to audience being able to participate as well. So.
Thank you. So I'm addressing the second question. I just want to say I'm been very transnational this month with Canada because the Edmonton Oilers have one of their star players is a very Jewish guy from Toronto. So unlike the other articles in this volume, and again, Harriet and Adina, kudos to you for pulling this together. I'm making no comparisons across countries, but nonetheless, I consider this, my research, influenced by two transnational perspectives. The first is Sergio's work, going way back, showing that Jews have remarkably similar patterns of settlement in cities in Europe and Latin America. And this got me thinking about American cities. What are the patterns of Jewish residents there? And of course, my good geography influence, Irish Eskin, is here, and he certainly has got me interested in this, as well as I'll put in a plug for the North American Jewish Data Bank. This is one of the great resources that we have on this. The second is that I use transnationalism, or a transnational concept of ethnoburb, as like a telescope filter. So in astronomy, you put different filters on telescopes and you see different things. And you can't see them without that filter. So for me, the ethnoburb filter is brings American Jewish suburbanization literally into a whole new light, which is that we've taken them for granted as a place of assimilation, and they're always there, so we never think about them. But the concept of ethnoburb actually raises the question, like, why are they still there? Why is it that Jews have similar residential and communal patterns to Chinese immigrants? And I'm particularly interested in this. I should say I became aware of this whole concept of ethnoburbs because they are from Southern California, where we have a large Chinese immigrant population. One of my UCLA colleagues in the early 90s started researching Monterey Park, which was a suburb in the San Gabriel Valley that was increasingly becoming Chinese, and the Anglo population was resisting it. They passed a law, no signs, only English can you have signs in Monterey Park, because they didn't want all these Chinese shopping malls or mini malls developing. And then a geographer, Wei Li, coined the term later in the 90s of ethnoburb to describe this phenomenon. It's since been applied to Armenians and some other groups, but no one's really thought about Jews as ethnoburbs. So what defines an ethnoburb, and what does immigrant Chinese have to do with American Jews in Encino and Highland Park? So there are three dimensions to an ethnoburb. One is density. They're multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual, multinational communities, but the ethnic minority doesn't have to be the majority. They just have to have a substantial population presence. Most importantly, they're the result of residential choice, not segregation. So there are Hispanic suburbs in Southern California those are the result of economic and largely economic segregation. They're working class communities for working class Hispanics, but the Chinese immigrants, have enough means to live anywhere. The third is that they strengthen group life. So using Los Angeles and Chicago as case studies, I found that all these criteria actually apply to places like Encino and Woodland Hills and Tarzana. Can't find a better name for a suburb than Tarzana, as well as Highland Park and Evanston in the Chicago area. So I actually plan to expand this research to look at other cities and look at such variables as the size of the Jewish population, Eastern cities versus Western cities, Fortis cities or industrial cities, Rust Belt cities versus post-industrial cities. But basically, transnationalism, for me, prompts me as a sociologist to pay attention to Jewish suburbs in a way that we haven't seen them before, and it also provides a conceptual framework by which to understand them.
Thank you. Dalia?
Yes, I just wanted to start also by just saying what a pleasure it is to be among all of the contributors and participants, and also a big thank you to you, Harriet, and of course to all of the co-editors of this really important journal edition. So I am also tackling question number 2, and my article has to do with anthropology and the movement of anthropology as a transnational one. And so while I absolutely recognize the value, the importance in the fruit of such, comparative studies, I think that when you have studies that provide maybe more intersectional perspectives, it allows for kind of different types of inquiry. And I am trained as a historian. And I am looking at cultural, intellectual, and political legacies, and then how they have impact across different times and place. So, for example, in this article, I looked at 2 women who are Mexican American, meaning U.S. Mexican is their duality, Jews, who both have connections to Franz Boas, who of course is the father of anthropology, the one who establishes a department at Columbia University, the father of American anthropology. And in looking more deeply into scholarship about his background and how it connects to the birth of German ethnography, and how that connects also to German Jewish emancipation, and then Franz Boas's own sort of political ideas in the US when the US is becoming quite nationalistic. I also just was able to appreciate how movements that are quite nationalistic owe so much to international movements and fields of inquiry. So for example, by looking at how the anthropology the Anthropology Museum of Mexico City acted after the revolution, and who its leadership was, and the connections that they had to specifically Franz Boas and his type of ethnography that he furthered, which was cultural relativism, that really gave space and legitimacy to all cultures in their diversity, rather than kind of this teleological schema of history from advanced, from barbaric to advanced, and how that gave space, right, for the indigenous in Mexico, how that might have been adopted by certain members of the intelligentsia, of the bohemian art scene, and also politicians. We really can understand how Jews in Latin America are really participants in global streams of academics, of art, of politics. They're part of international Jewish institutes and institutions, but also of others, of academics and nationalistic and artistic circles that are not defined, by Jewish parameters. And so I think that, to provide these kind of intersectional perspectives that really connect different areas of the Americas with each other and also with other parts of the world. It provides a certain richness to understand what might be seen otherwise as very local or nationalistic movements. I think I'll end there.
Thank you. I know that a few of the panelists wanted to comment more on this question. I'm going to move to the next question and see what time we have left for you to have second rounds of commenting on the broader implications of this special issue, so that we get a couple of the people who haven't talked yet to address this third set of question, which was, and we've already heard some hints at this. What's missing in this volume? Is there anything that could have been, should have been, should be in the future, or could be in the future? And where is the Jews in the Americas project heading in the future? What are the obstacles or facilitators to this kind of project? And are there other regions of the Jewish world that should take this kind of perspective? Should we be looking at East and West Europe? Should we be looking at other kinds of regions? So I'm going to ask Naomi and then Daniel to comment on this. And then if any of the panelists are dying to say one more thing or two more things, and then open it up to the audience. And I just want to remind the people who are listening, if you have a comment that you'd like to put in the chat, I'll be sure to get back to you. Otherwise, you'll be able to raise your hands and whatever, we'll get there. Naomi, then Daniel.
Well, first, I'd like to thank everyone involved, my fellow editors, fellow authors, Harriet Hartman, just everybody involved in this project, which really evolved over a long time. First, a conference in 2015 at the University of Texas, then a conference at UBC in Vancouver in 2019. So it's been a long time in the making, and we're delighted to actually get a look at it, put our hands on it. So the special issue that we're launching today, I'd like to point out that it's the most interdisciplinary number of contemporary Jewry that's ever been published. It goes well beyond the social sciences and history, which is sometimes featured in CJ, and it includes literary and cultural studies. So I'm hoping this might be a harbinger of things to come, that the cultural world is getting its foot inside the pages of contemporary Jewry. I'd like to point out the second most interdisciplinary issue of contemporary Jewry was the July 2018 issue, which featured Judit's Sclair Award address and the responses to it. So that issue with Judit's Sclair Award speech and our responses really contained the seeds of this new volume. Something else you might notice, or I noticed, 4 of the 10 authors of our new volume are very active in LACSA, the Latin American Jewish Studies Association. And in fact, looking at the audience members here at the webinar, a lot of them are from LACSA. So I would hope for continuing cooperation between the ASSJ and the Latin American Jewish Studies Association. It appears there's quite a bit of correspondence in our concerns. Now for the question asked, what we've done differently, future avenues of collaboration and research. Of course, there were some colleagues we would have liked to included, but their schedules or other commitments precluded their participation. For example, might have been nice to bring on an anthropologist, although Dalia Wassner did cover quite a bit of anthropology as a historian. In retrospect, I would most like to have included someone from the field of fine arts, an art historian, or a musicologist. So these sound like regrets. You know, I wish we asked a musicologist, but there are things to keep in mind for the future, because this volume, even though it's published, is really a point of departure for future activities that we envision, such as workshops, collaborative articles, seminars, and the occasional international conference. If anyone attending this event would like to be involved in these future endeavors, by all means, approach us, because we're broadening our base of participants. And this includes anyone based at European universities. Scholars at European universities have been a bit underrepresented, but we would like to see them there. So one question that especially deserves our consideration, where are we in the study of Jews in the Americas? Meaning projects that cover Jewish populations and cultural production in Latin America, the US, and Canada. Because in the past few years, we've seen this enormous proliferation of Jewish studies projects whose title includes the phrase, in the Americas. Some of them are compilations of primary sources. Some of them are conferences. Some of them are compilations of essays like ours. Some are lecture series, some are entire programs. But all this activity, where is it heading? And what sort of conceptual frameworks are being developed to orient or organize this mushrooming field of activity? Clearly, the authors involved in our volume all took a transnational approach of some type, and it has been serving us well, but it's not the only possibility. However, some sort of organizing framework or way of getting a conceptual handle on all this activity is needed. So when a field of study has been growing very rapidly, it's always useful to have a state of the art or a review of the research carried out. And in this case, we'd like to do that. The review would need to be undertaken by an interdisciplinary team. We're thinking of ourselves. It could produce a roadmap to the current state of research on Jews in the Americas, as well as suggesting some future avenues of research. So as well as taking the big view, looking at this whole field and trying to figure out where it's going, how it can be more coherent. There's also lots of room for individual research topics. We've heard about some of them. I myself have been mulling over one having to do with Jewish intellectuals who not only cross borders in the Americas, but also cultivate more than one reading public in the case of writers, or viewing public in the case of filmmakers. This might mean simply publics in different languages. The writer that I concerned myself with in our volume was Ariel Dorfman, who's written both for English language and for Spanish language publics in often quite different ways, or as well, cultivating a public who's more interested in Jewish topics and wants to hear more about the Jewishness of the writer or about views on Jewish topics versus a general public that is not particularly interested in Jewish anything. So in conclusion, I'd like to stress that the volume is published, but it represents a project that's ongoing. We mean to continue, have more conferences, more webinars, more articles, more volumes. And again, I'd like to invite anyone who is interested in all this in participating to approach us. Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel?
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to thank to you, Harriet, and to all the editors of this project for the opportunity to appear in my paper. I think that this is a huge contribution, this volume, on this transnational perspective, interdisciplinary perspective that we mentioned. And I think that we have here very important, in some way fragmented, illuminating papers. And I think that thinking in moving forward, I have some ideas that maybe can be for some interest for some of you. First, before mention these new approaches that I think that can be helpful and can be very fruitful, I want to say something related with the figure that Laura Limonic mentioned in his study about Chabad Lubavitch and the transnational religiosity, is the differences between the religion of the migrants against the religious entrepreneurs. We can have this is a very important difference, in my opinion, between the religion that the immigrants brought from let's say, the experience from Germany, from Eastern Europe, or from the Ottoman Empire. And on the other side, we have people who came specifically as religious entrepreneurs to promote some specific kind of religiosity with their peoples. Chabad Lubavitch fits in this model. Marshall Meyer fits in this model. And the figure of the religious entrepreneur, I think it's a very interesting figure to understand the interaction between agency, structures, change, and to understand the dynamics, the religious dynamics in Latin America and worldwide. With regards to the where we can move forward, I have some ideas based on the rich conceptual framework developed by Judit Liwerant and the complex demographic perspectives developed by Sergio DellaPergola. I think that we have some framework, common framework, to initiate an articulated transnational research project on the Jews in the Americas, of course, with interdisciplinary teams to deal with different topics that some were mentioned by some of the participants. For instance, what about a history of the private life in the model of the French scholars Phillips and Jewry about the daily life experiences of the Jews in the Americas, done by historians, anthropologists in different areas, to have this sense of the daily life, and to see the commonalities and the differences. I think that we have room there. Another idea, for instance, like taking also the contribution of George Duby and Michel Perrot about the history of women and gender studies. What about being a Jewish woman in Latin America? Because there we see all kind of issues. I have a discussion a few days ago with a Reform rabbi who came to Mexico, and I spoke about the importance of structures in keeping identity and the differences that mentioned Sergio DellaPergola between Latin American Jewry and American Jewry, and he said the women in Mexico are the victims of the structure. Is that true? How can we understand these topics? Another thing that I think is the history of Jews, as mentioned Bruce about the ethnoverbs. We have also ethnoverbs in Latin America, in Buenos Aires, in San Pablo, in Mexico City, but also what it means to live in small Jewish communities in Canada, the USA, and Latin America. I think that we can have a very rich and interesting comparison between what do they have same commonalities because of the size of the communities, or there are huge differences based on the cultural and the nature of each of the communities. I think that if we want to go forward in this direction, we need to have some kind of planning together to be able to establish a framework with different scholars interested in those fields, and to build an interdisciplinary team that can be helpful in this regard. Also, for instance, the topic of Israel, which today is a very key issue, differentiating, I think, what's the trends that are developing in the States vis-a-vis what's going on in Latin America, where I have a research on that topic, where there are huge differences. What the place of Israel in the imaginary, in the institutional framework, in the diasporic ideologies that are being developed or no. I think that we have a lot of a long way to go, but I think that this is a very positive and important beginning, and I'm very happy to be part of this in this endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I know we have one comment that, Carmel, that you wanted to bring up. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for this interesting question, as well as some of the interesting answers. I'd like to put in my 2 cents and wearing my hat as an economic historian. I tend to look at Jewish history as a controlled experiment over time and space. And that's how I look at this transnational Judaism in the Americas. First, for the economic context and the history. The immigrants that came to the Americas in the mid-19th century came to a region of economic, I won't say backwardness exactly, but it was a new world, a new country, and an economy in which there were relatively few people compared to the land and the new settlements out towards the west. And the niche, the economic niche, was the peddlers. Hasia Diener has written about Jewish peddlers mainly in the United States, but she also has some very interesting comparisons between the peddlers in Central America and in some of the South American Jewish communities. And I think that migration and that background sort of explains a lot about the roots of small town, rural towns, Jewish communities. But the later migration, the ones from Russia that were referred to,
Oh, I think we are having,
economy, if not in the world, then at least in the Western Hemisphere, its competition only appeared to be Argentina.
we are having a problem.
We lost Carmel.
I think if Promosh could close her video, stop her video, maybe.
I don't know what happened, but I lost my connection all of a sudden.
Yeah.
I'm trying to, okay, I'm sorry, I don't know. But let me just say the Russian migration was much larger, but it was 50 years later. New York was a high-tech city at that time, and it was a fast-growing city. And the settlement, the immigrants found jobs in cities, in the new industries, in the new technologies. And that's the difference between urban, big city Jewish enclaves and the rural Jewish settlements. So I think that that's important. And what we shared with the South America was the former, the peddler economy rather than the high-tech economy. But there was another really big difference between the political institutional context in the United States or North America and Latin America. And that had to do not just with democracy and the political institutions, but with the state religion. As recently as the mid-1960s, Latin American countries were predominantly Catholic countries, where Catholicism was in fact a state religion. And Jews reacted differently when they settled in countries with a state religion than in countries where religious pluralism was accepted. And that was related to the fact that as recently as the 1960s, Latin American countries were considered underdeveloped. The aid program, US aid program in the mid-60s was directed to three big efforts in South America, the big countries that were less developed, not the little countries, but of like 8 countries in the world that we gave big bucks in foreign aid, 3 of them were in Latin America. So that's a big difference in the economic context, the political context, that over time, as well as over space. And that should shape the way we look at the way these Jewish communities develop socially, economically, and in terms of their own identity, how they related as Jews to the larger community in which they live.
Thank you. I want to comment on Olaf's comment in the chat, because we did have a special issue on Jews in Iberia, and it actually looked at some of the changes that are happening now in Portugal and Spain, and it's related to Latin America. So it's another transnational aspect that really is appropriate. So thank you. I know, Judit, you wanted to say something. And since we're getting very close to the end, in terms of time, I mean, whoever wants to stay on I've got another half hour and you can stay on, but I know that many of you have scheduled in and you're going to be needing to leave in 5 minutes. So before I give it the floor to Judit, I'm just going to say, I think this has been really interesting, and there are lots of good ideas for where this can go and how it can expand. And I really appreciate everybody putting their thought into this and thinking about it. And I appreciate all of the comments that went into the chat. I think they're really interesting as well. Judit?
Yes, well, while we are attending this very interesting gathering, I become aware that only the editors until now know all the content of the issue. And that's immediately for us I would say a challenge, right? Because there were so many convergences in the participations today that I would suggest a second webinar after people reading each other and finding convergences would be great. This is one first comment. The second, well, I must recognize, listening to you, Naomi, that you had a very important role in all this, in the genesis, in sheet of this project. You attended, I would say, the preliminary idea in a workshop in Jerusalem, where Latin Americans were looking after transnational perspectives. And then you could take this from Jerusalem to Austin, to the Schusterman Center. Bob entered this dynamic, and this project developed in a very, I would say, interesting way. Now, why Latin Americans should look after transnationalism, right? Well, because we are aware that we need conceptually and practically overcome this idea of a binary center-periphery. And for this, all the Jewish dimension of a world Jewish system could let us understand all the way we interact, the circulations, etc. So I want to tell you that we are already working in the next steps, that the ideas that were here presented were great. I like the idea, l'histoire de la vie privée. Now, not only the Jewish dimension in the Jewish kitchen and the women, but also all these perspectives that were raised today. And well, probably I will follow my dear Harriet and say that we would like to have you as members of the Association of Social Scientific Study of Jewry that needs as much oxygen of an interdisciplinary perspective as we were remarking in our own future event. So we are inviting you, because becoming member means also having the access to the Contemporary Jewry Journal, which is our really, I would say, precious product. And also we have a book series that you are all welcome. In fact, the next one is coming. The book that is now coming out has a Canadian source plus an Israeli participation. I mean, it's a global perspective. So that's what I wanted to say. Of course, I thank you all very much. We have worked so well. Now we need. So Harriet, this is an invitation to have very soon a second webinar that may focus on several aspects that were raised today, right? So I don't know if we stay or if we must say goodbye, whatever you decide, Harriet. You are leading this session.
Yes, but it's not up to me. It's up to whoever is here. Whoever, is there someone who would like to talk more? Raise your hand, start talking. Adina.
Sergio, you're not the only outsider in the room, but I wanted to say, as someone who several years ago, the beginning of writing my doctoral dissertation on Jewish connectedness in Australia with an academic panel that had never heard of a Jew before, They said, you're such a small group. Why bother? Why not invest in a bigger group, a sexier topic? And I go back to Harriet's first question, why should we look at the Americas? Who's we? To me, it was my community, and my community was entitled to understand itself and understand itself in context of the rest of the Jewish world. Who are we? We is not just the United States and the 90, perhaps 80% of where Jewish research is happening. It's everywhere. And I think that all of us gain from comparative research, transnational research, not only so that we can go back to our communities and explain ourselves, but explain ourselves in context of that world. And having had the incredible opportunity to sit with Sergio and have a look at his social structure analysis and see how so many communities have peoplehood at their heart. Part of peoplehood is knowing how we sit in relation to the rest of the Jewish people around the world. And I think that for a lot of people that would really resonate. So Harriet and all the editors, thank you so much for making this issue possible. And Ken Yirbu, I hope it continues.
Thank you.
I would like to thank you, Adina, for kindly mentioning this. One of the persons in the audience now raised the question of the language. In fact, on the one hand, English is a kind of lingua franca, and on the other hand, it does not do really justice to Spanish or Portuguese or French, which are languages practiced in the continent, or other languages. This is a dilemma, and to show the problematic, I hold in my hand by show and tell. This is something we do in kindergarten. The book I'm holding here is called Pertenencia y Alteridad, Judíos en/de América Latina, 40 años de cambios. This is a spectacular collective work which has been produced slightly more than 10 years ago with the editorship of Judit, with Chaim Avni, with Margalit Bejarano, Leonardo Senkman, and myself. And the problem is that this, which is a book of 900 pages and a fantastic book, is virtually unknown north of the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo, call it like you prefer. And this is the dilemma. Should we translate everything into the other language or try to publish mixed language collections? I don't know if someone has a better idea, but the fact is that unfortunately the linguistic barrier is still impairing and hindering what we would like to do together.
So
sorry.
I'm in a Haredim, a research group on Haredim, and we just put up on the website our main paragraphs in English, in Hebrew, and in Yiddish. You know, like it's possible to work with the language, but it's a challenge. Yeah.
Well, Harriet, I wanted, following what Adina and Sergio said, I want to refer, yes, Sergio, you're right. This monumental book is not only, what can I say? It's not known, not only in the English world speaking, but also in the Spanish world speaking. And this is a question we have to raise, how knowledge circulates. And there is still another point. We have 2 volumes where we collaborated and more people that were here on the Transnational Latin American Jewish Educator. And this is closely related to the discussion we are holding at our association on the levels of knowledge. Is conceptual and theoretical knowledge, applied knowledge, how academia goes towards policy decisions, towards community, right? And what we discover is that these are topics that we have to explore, both south of the border up to the Patagonia and in the northern sphere. So I see here also a potential a series of webinars. We have been talking already with Harriet about how knowledge in the academia is related to the communal level, but also to the national one. Adina, I want to expand the we. The we is not only our communities. The we is our, I would say, our countries, our regions. We need also to be able to present this unknown reality of the Jewish world, the Jewish culture. And this is for us, I would say, a duty. So that's what I wanted to add, Harriet.
Thank you. Great. I want to commend all of us for managing to make a panel of 12, have such an inspiring discussion. I think it left a lot of people with a lot of thoughts. I do want to mention that Richard Menkis was unfortunate, who was part of this group and one of the co-editors, was unable to make it today, and I didn't mention him before, so at least I'm mentioning him now. And I know that there are others who were in the audience and who some are maybe still here, who could contribute to future endeavors about Jews in the Americas, and I'm sure that it can expand and grow, and I look forward to that. I look forward to hearing more about it. It was a privilege of mine to be the editor-in-chief, so that I had to read everything and really get it, understand it. So I really gained from that. So thank you all, and see you next time, I hope. Bye.